Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first attempted settlement. In this series right now, we're talking about the evolution of county government. And in the episode that we had recently, we talked about how Andrew Jackson arrived here in 1821 and meeting before the entire assembly of Pensacola citizens, about 700 of them, raised the American flag and then announced how the governmental system was going to work with a chartered system for Pensacola, the appointment of 3 commissioners for all of Escambia County, which, by the way, went all the way to the Suwannee River, and then, of course, the creation of a territorial assembly, which would be the equivalent of a state legislature. And so he put it all together. And during the first 10 years of our territorial status, Pensacola began to grow primarily because of the creation of the Navy Yard by the federal government, and then, of course, the establishment of a system of forts to protect the Navy Yard. We come to the early part of the 1830s, and now some very interesting things are beginning to happen. We have to reflect on this, particularly from the county's standpoint. Bear in mind, I mentioned a moment ago that Andrew Jackson brought with him a charter for the city of Pensacola. There was no charter for Escambia County. That was in 1821. And as we bring this presentation to you today, there still is no charter for county government. County government originally was to deal with roads, bridges, and ferries, and all of the other things which have been adopted and managed and funded by county government have just kind of grown like Topsy did, with no charter to guide them, which was, of course, a part of the problem that some of the county activities have encountered. Well, we move into the early part of the 1830s, and this area, Pensacola, Escambia County, is much like what was happening. We're looking at an event which was much like what was taking place up in the Northeast, and that was the coming of the idea of railroads, because people now suddenly saw that instead of having to travel by horse and wagon or the very long circuitous route by water, now there was a way to move from point A to point B more rapidly. And of course, every area wished to have its own railroad. And Pensacola and Escambia County were very typical, because basically we were landlocked. There was no easy way to get from Pensacola to anywhere unless you went by water. So having a railroad was important. And of course, one of the things that you almost had to have to begin a railroad was a mechanism for funding, and that usually involved the creation or the presence of a bank. And so in 1833, after 3 failures, a group of local men led by a man named Walter Gregory put together a charter which was approved by the territorial legislature, who incidentally had to override the veto of Governor Duval to get this paper in place. And now we had the creation of what became known as the Bank of Pensacola, which was a commercial bank, but its founders had as one of their primary desires, it was the ability to draft and sell bonds to fund a railroad, which they did. And as we move forward into the 1830s, the railroad began. Men were hired to do the work. Original supplies arrived, and all was going very well on the Alabama, Florida, Georgia railroad from here to Columbus, Georgia. And then, of course, the Panic of 1837 came in, and the whole financial tent collapsed, and the railroad and the bank both went out of business. Okay, we move into the early part of the 1840s, and now across the entire country, we are beginning to see 3 major political issues forming, which are going to have their effect everywhere. These issues were, number one, the presence of high tariffs, which had been enacted by the Congress to protect the infant industries in the Northeast. Secondly, was the idea of slavery. Where would slavery be permitted to expand into the territories that had been acquired, first of all, by the Monroe Doctrine, and which would be acquired a little bit later when the Mexican War ended. And the third major point was a number of states, particularly South Carolina, looking at the issues of slavery and tariffs, began to say, look, when we entered the Union in 1789, we did so voluntarily. It was our desire to do that. Thus, we have the right to withdraw, to secede if we choose to do so. And these three issues began to bubble up, so much so that by the time we reached the mid-1830s, people here in Florida are beginning to say, now, we perhaps need to work quickly to become a state. Because if we achieve statehood, then we have a vote in the Congress. Because up to this time, all that the territory of Florida had was a member of the Congress who was simply an observer. He had no vote, and that man was there to make the ideas and the wishes of the people here known. But basically, he had no effect at all. But now people were saying we ought to do this. We ought to become a state. We had about the necessary 50,000 people here, which was an initial requirement, and but then people began to say, "Now wait a minute. Let's look at this further. If we wait a little longer, we'll be able to divide Florida in half, and we'll may have two states instead of just one. That would mean 4 senators, etc., etc." And about the same time, 1835, Texas became a part of the Union, and now it was possible. Of course, people were beginning to consider what might be done in Texas. Here was one huge state, and people were saying, "Well, get the proper number of people. We might have 3 states, 4, 5, 6, who knows?" And that was part of the philosophy as we moved to 1838. And that was when Escambia County, its commissioners, Pensacola, and its councilmen agreed that they would go along with the rest of the territory and go through the steps to become a state. And this, of course, meant, first of all, creating a constitutional assembly. And that assembly had to write a document, which was the Constitution for a new state. And secondly, once they had that approved, it had to be signed by the governor. Then it had to be voted on by the people. And once that was done, then it would be sent to Washington to the Congress, and the Congress would ultimately approve it, and we would become a state. Well, the process went forward. Escambia County had its representatives, led by Benjamin Drake Wright, the attorney and owner of the Pensacola Gazette newspaper. They all met in the little Gulfside village of St. Joseph. They wrote the Constitution. It was approved by the legislative body in January of 1839. Then it was sent to the voters. And next time you wake up on a election day, and you say, "Well, it's raining. They really don't need my vote. I'll stay home." But basically, remember what happened in this assembly and this balloting in 1839. When the final vote was taken, there were 1,937 people who said yes and 1,867 who said no. It was that close, but the vote was taken, and now the proposition could be sent to the Congress, and it was, but it took 7 years before we became a state, because the Congress said, "All right, we will allow you to come in, but there has to be a balancing state up in the north that will have an opposite view on the extension of slavery." And so we waited until early 1845, and only then did Florida become a state. We were a companion moving into the Union with the state of Iowa. Well, as all of this is going on, of course, the United States is involved in certain other things. One of these, of course, was a situation involving the nation's relationships with Mexico. The Texas situation had been very, very difficult for everyone. That isn't our story in Pensacola, but nonetheless, Texas had become a state. There were bad feelings back and forth. Bad things were happening, and finally, in the early part of 1846, President Polk and his cabinet agreed that they were going to take things in hand and put the Mexicans in their place, and war began. Once again, that is not a long story for Pensacola, except that as war began, the strategy was that they were going to, the United States was going to put together a military, naval, or Army, Navy task force, which would be operating from vessels that would literally blockade the eastern coast of Mexico. Now, to get the vessels on station, the plan was to send them from the eastern seaboard to Pensacola for final conditioning and for adding a 6-month supply of biscuit and water. Well, that started out, and Pensacola's people thought this was just fine because we'd had a Navy Yard now for over 20 years. They hadn't done much. Right now, the first vessels began to arrive, and when the commanding officer here recognized what was in place, what he had to do, he quickly threw up his hands. Now, wait a minute, we collect all our water from rainfall, and we've got a nice little oven over here that takes care of the biscuit that we need here, but it'll take us months to bake a biscuit for one ship. And so quickly, the townspeople and the Navy people moved together. They became a team. Wells were dug, additional ovens were built, and consequently the needs were made, and the Navy and the Army went forward and successfully bested the Mexicans. And at the end of that, of course, at the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States gained a huge new section of territory, which would take our country almost to the West Coast and California. Well, it did take us to California. Excuse me. We got California in addition. All right, we move into the 1850s, and county government here is changing very little. We move forward. We're still operating our county, and our city government is being conducted in the old Spanish-built government house down on the waterfront. Not a whole lot is changing, but because basically Escambia County still was heavily forested. There were little brick plants and lumber mills along the river, but basically to the north there was no easily cleared farmland, and so we were not an agricultural state to any extent in this point. We moved through the middle 1850s. Our Navy Yard does at this time have the first and only opportunity it had to build two naval vessels, and they did. And we come up then, of course, to 1860 when the critical election took place, and Mr. Abraham Lincoln from Illinois bested three different Democrats who were all running separately on different tickets, and Mr. Lincoln became the new president. Well, of course, when that happened, and it's a different story that we have told to you in a more detailed account of Pensacola and the war between the states. But basically, from the standpoint of the county had precious little to do with what would take place in the next year and a half. Basically, the only thing the commissioners were really interested in was that they were working with a new company that was constructing a railroad from the Pensacola docks north to what was then being called Pollard Junction, just over the Alabama border. And of course, the county was working with the railroad company, making sure that the right-of-way was in the right position and that all of the proper taxes and fees were being paid. And that railroad went into action, became operational in June of 1861. It lasted just 11 months because it was torn up and destroyed when the Confederate forces were withdrawn from Pensacola in May of 1862. Okay, the war goes forward. We have very little to say about county government in the following 3.5 years, except that finally, when 1865 came, people came back, and many of the same men who had been operating as constitutional officers, as a sheriff, as tax collector and so on. They were the same men who reestablished office, but county government in 1865-66 had this problem. It was dead broke. The Confederate currency was worthless. The bonds that people might have bought were worthless. People couldn't pay taxes if they wanted to because they had no money. And so for the next 3 to 4 years, it was a very, very difficult time for everyone here. And of course, we began to rebuild the railroad, which was of great value by 1870. And things remained almost in limbo until 1870, which was a magic year for Escambia County and Pensacola, because it was in that year that the railroad was completed, that the fishing industry was able to come into being, that we began to enjoy huge orders for lumber from Europe. So we had 3 new industries suddenly coming up, so that Pensacola and Escambia County began to prosper, while most of the rest of the South was still on its economic knees. Now, we were still under Reconstruction, the federal edict to oversee county and state governments, but nonetheless, Pensacola staggered along. I wish I could give you full names of all of the county commissioners who were involved, but we're showing a few of them right now to show you who was here and working in 1870.